Spring of 1883 spilled over Montana, like water over parched earth, but Clara Whitmore barely noticed. The wind combed the prairies with invisible fingers, creating waves in the sea of grass that surrounded the small cabin where she lived. That place, inherited from her father, was all she had left. A modest property, the wooden cabin with its stone chimney, the rickety stable, a garden that struggled to survive, and the small grove of wild plum trees that swayed in the distance. Clara watched the horizon from the porch, her gaze fixed on the line where sky kissed earth. Her eyes, the color of amber under the sun, reflected the vastness that surrounded her. Sometimes she thought she had become part of the landscape herself, motionless, resistant, silent as the mountains that outlined in the distance. Every corner of the property carried with it the echo of her father. The stable he had built with his own hands, the floorboards that creaked in exactly the same places where he stepped, the smell of wood and damp earth that seemed to have impregnated the walls. At night, when the silence became too dense, Clara would open the old cedar chest and take out the blue shawl that had belonged to her mother. She held it against her face, searching for a scent that had disappeared years ago. "Time erases everything except the essence," her father had told her before departing for that last winter that took him away forever. Clara carefully put away the shawl, like one who guards a secret. During the day, while feeding the chickens, or repairing what she could of the fence, she sometimes found herself speaking aloud, as if someone could hear her. But only the wind responded, carrying her words toward the mountains. The nights were the hardest. The creaking of wood, the distant hooting of an owl, the whistling of wind through the cracks. Everything acquired a different dimension when darkness enveloped the prairie. Clara would light the oil lamp and sit by the window, contemplating. The stars that seemed so close and so unreachable at the same time, like her past, like the possibility of a different future. Sometimes in the distance she could see the lights of the town, small yellow dots that flickered like fireflies, reminding her that a world existed beyond her solitude. But Clara had learned to live on the margins, to find comfort in silence, to understand the language of the earth. Her father had taught her to be strong, not to depend on anyone, to resist like the wild plum trees that survived the cruelest frosts. However, on the darkest nights, when the wind seemed to speak with human voices, Clara wondered how long a person could live like this, suspended between memory and waiting, inhabiting a present that stretched like the prairie, endless and empty. That day began like any other. Clara woke with the first ray of sun, washed her face with cold water from the well, and went out to feed the animals. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh grass. It had rained during the night, a gentle rain that had barely left traces except for the crystalline shine on the leaves and the mud on the path. She was collecting eggs in the chicken coop when she saw him. A dark figure advancing down the path, silhouetted against the horizon like a solitary shadow. Clara straightened slowly, feeling her heart accelerate. Visitors were rare in that part of the prairie, and a woman alone could not afford the luxury of naivety. The man approached with tired steps, carrying a heavy bundle on his shoulders. He wore worn and dust-covered clothes, and a thick beard covered part of his face. Clara quickly returned to the cabin, took her father's shotgun, and waited on the porch, with the weapon leaning against the wall, visible enough to serve as a warning. "Good morning, ma'am," said the man when he was close enough. His voice was deep but soft, like water flowing over stones. "My name is Elias Boone. I'm on my way to Fort Benton, and wondered if I could get something to eat before continuing my journey." Clara observed him in silence. He didn't look like a vagrant or a bandit. His eyes, of a blue as deep as the sky after a storm, reflected fatigue, but there was something more in them, something Clara recognized as a quiet pain, an invisible wound he carried with him as part of his luggage. "I can pay you," he added, taking some coins from his pocket. Clara shook her head. Money was scarce, but her father had taught her that denying food to a traveler was denying one's own humanity. "Keep your money, Mr. Boone," she finally responded. "You can sit there while I prepare something." The initial distrust didn't disappear completely, but Clara allowed the man to sit on a bench by the door while she went inside to prepare a simple meal. From the kitchen window she could observe him. He seemed absorbed contemplating the prairie, as if memorizing every detail of the landscape. When she brought him the plate with eggs, bread, and a bit of dried meat, he received it with a nod of his head. "You are very kind," he said, before beginning to eat with the dignity of one who knows what true hunger is. "Do you come from far away?" Clara asked, maintaining a prudent distance. "From everywhere and nowhere," he responded after swallowing a bite. "I've been moving since the war." Clara nodded. She didn't need to ask which war he referred to. She had seen many men like him, marked by a conflict that had divided the country and left invisible scars on those who had lived through it. "You can spend the night in the stable if you wish," Clara offered, surprising herself with her own words. But just this night. Elias Boone looked at her with an expression that Clara couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly gratitude, but a kind of silent recognition, as if they both shared a language that didn't need words. "I thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," she completed. "Clara Whitmore." That night, from her bedroom window, Clara observed the small light that shone in the stable. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't the only flame lit in the middle of the prairie's darkness. The days on the prairie had their own rhythm, marked by the sun and the needs of the earth. Clara had grown accustomed to that cadence, to the repetition of gestures that became rituals, collecting water from the well at dawn, feeding the animals, checking the fences, tending the garden. A solitary choreography that she executed with the precision of one who has learned that survival depends on every small detail. Therefore, Elias Boone's presence altered that balance like a stone thrown into a still pond. What should have been? A brief pause in his journey to Fort Benton extended first one day, then two, then a week. Each morning Clara found him already awake, busy with some task he assigned himself, repairing the chicken coop roof, strengthening a fence, cutting wood, that he meticulously stacked next to the cabin. "You don't have to do that," Clara told him one afternoon, while watching him tame the stubborn mule she had never managed to control. "I know," he responded simply, without taking his gaze from the animal, "but your hands already have too much work." There was something in the way Elias moved around the property, a kind of respect toward the land and toward Clara's space, that gradually disarmed her defenses. He didn't invade, didn't impose his presence. He was simply there, solid and silent, like the trees that grew at the edge of the property. One afternoon, while returning from checking the north fence, Clara stopped by the small grove of plum trees. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, and some late petals floated in the air like pink snowflakes. "My father planted these trees when I was born," she said, breaking the silence that usually stretched between them. "He said they would grow. With me, that they would teach me about patience and endurance." Elias didn't respond immediately. He approached one of the trees and passed his calloused fingers over the bark, with the same care he would use to touch something precious and fragile. "Trees have memory," he said finally. "They keep in their rings every winter they've survived, every drought, every storm. Everything is recorded inside them." Clara looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. There was something in Elias's voice, in the way his eyes surveyed the landscape, that made her think he too held many stories within himself. "Where did you learn about trees, Mr. Boone?" "My father was a carpenter," he responded, and a shadow crossed his face. "He taught me to read wood, to understand what each grain meant. He said that trees tell us stories, if we know how to listen to them." It was the first time Elias mentioned something about his past, and Clara felt something shift between them, like tectonic plates moving silently beneath the surface. That night they dined together in the cabin. The fireplace fire projected dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate space that contrasted with the dark immensity outside. Clara had prepared a stew with vegetables from the garden and a rabbit that Elias had hunted. "You should teach me to hunt," Clara said while serving the food. "My father tried to teach me, but I never had good aim." "Hunting isn't just about aim," Elias responded, accepting the plate she offered him. "It's about patience, about understanding the rhythms of the earth and the animals, about moving with them, not saying them." Clara nodded, thinking that philosophy seemed to apply to many things in life. They sat at the table, separated by polished wood, and by everything they didn't yet know about each other, but united by something that was beginning to bloom slowly, like the plum trees after winter. Summer advanced with long, hot steps over the prairie, transforming green into golden tones that swayed in the constant wind. Clara and Elias had established a silent routine that worked like a well-calibrated clock. Each knew their place. Each task found willing hands to perform it. The cabin, which for so long had been a space of solitude, now vibrated with a different energy, as if the walls themselves breathed to the rhythm of a new life. It was on one of those luminous mornings when the sound of horse hooves broke the harmony of the day. Clara was in the garden, pulling weeds between the rows of carrots and onions, when the elongated shadow of a rider projected over the earth. Silas Crowley dismounted, with the studied elegance of a man accustomed to others watching his movements. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with an angular face framed by black hair that was beginning to show silver threads, Silas owned the neighboring lands, a ranch 10 times larger than Clara's small property. His presence always brought with it a sensation of cold, even on the hottest days. "Miss Whitmore," he greeted, removing his hat with a gesture that intended to be courteous, but that Clara had always found to be a parody of chivalry. "I see you've found help." His gaze shifted toward Elias, who had stopped his fence repair task and observed the scene with an impassive expression. "Mr. Boone is passing through," Clara responded, straightening and cleaning the dirt from her hands against her apron. "What brings you here, Mr. Crowley?" Silas smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold as river stones. "Business as always. I've been thinking about our previous conversation, about your situation." Clara tensed imperceptibly. The conversation Silas referred to had been more of a monologue where he had exposed, with a mixture of condescension and veiled threat, his intentions to acquire Clara's property. "My situation remains the same, Mr. Crowley," she responded, keeping her voice firm. "This land is not for sale." Silas took a step toward her, invading her space with the confidence of one accustomed to taking what he desires. "A woman alone doesn't last long on these lands, Miss Whitmore," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "And from what I see, your helper is nothing more than another vagabond, with boots worn from so much walking. How long do you think he'll stay before the horizon calls him again?" Clara held his gaze, but inside she felt the weight of the threat, cold and heavy like a stone in her stomach. Silas Crowley was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, whether by money, influence, or less honorable methods. Everyone in the county knew he had expanded his ranch by absorbing small properties whose owners had mysteriously decided to sell and leave. "I appreciate your concern," Clara responded with an irony she didn't try to hide, "but I assure you I can take care of myself and my property." Before Silas could respond, Elias approached them. There was nothing threatening in his posture, but something in the way he moved, with the contained fluidity of a predator, made Silas instinctively step back. "Mr. Crowley," Elias greeted with a nod, "I believe Miss Whitmore has made her position clear." Silas studied him with a calculating gaze, evaluating the man before him like one appraises a horse at a fair. "So, you're the famous traveler," he said finally. "News travels fast in the valley. How long will you honor us with your presence?" "Until it's no longer necessary," Elias responded without flinching. The two men looked at each other in silence, measuring each other in an invisible duel that Clara could feel vibrating in the air like electricity before a storm. Finally, Silas put his hat back on and mounted his black horse, which pranced nervously under its master's weight. "Think about my offer, Miss Whitmore," he said, but his eyes were fixed on Elias. "It remains open for now." When the sound of hooves was lost in the distance, Clara released the air she didn't know she had been holding. Elias looked at her with a silent question in his eyes. "He wants my land," she explained. "He says it would complete his property perfectly, that it's what my father would have wanted, that a woman alone can't maintain a place like this." Her voice broke slightly at the end, betraying the facade of strength she struggled to maintain. "And what is it that you want?" Elias asked, with a gentleness that contrasted with the hardness he had shown before Crowley. Clara looked around. The cabin where she was born, the stable her father had built, the garden that fed her table, the plum trees that grew a little taller toward the sky each year. Everything she was, everything she had, was rooted in that land like the trees themselves. "I want to stay," she responded simply. "This land is part of me." Elias nodded, as if he had expected exactly that answer. "Then I'll help you protect it," he said, and it didn't sound like a promise but like a statement of fact, as solid as the earth beneath their feet. Summer nights in Montana brought with them a special quietude, a silence populated by small sounds, the song of crickets, the whisper of wind through tall grass, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Clara had learned to find comfort in that nocturnal symphony, to decipher its messages, to feel accompanied by the voice of the prairie. That night, sitting on the cabin porch, she watched the star-studded sky that seemed so close she could almost imagine their cold, brilliant touch on her skin. Elias was beside her, carving a piece of wood with precise movements of his knife. Between them floated a comfortable silence, one of those that didn't need to be filled with words. The block of wood was taking shape under Elias's skilled hands, a small bird with wings spread as if about to take flight. Clara watched fascinated. As the figure emerged, how each cut revealed what was already there, waiting to be discovered. "My father used to say that every piece of wood already contains a form," Elias commented, without lifting his gaze from his work. "That the carver only has to find it, free it." Clara smiled, thinking of how her own father's hands had created so many things from wood, furniture, tools, toys for her when she was a child. "He said that too," she responded, and the coincidence seemed like a sign, as if somehow the paths of their lives had been destined to cross. "I used to sit beside him and watch him for hours, just like I'm doing now with you." It was the first time they had used the informal you, and the change floated between them like a leaf on water, delicate but significant. Elias raised his gaze, his eyes meeting Clara's in the penumbra illuminated only by the light escaping from the cabin window and the silvery glow of the moon. Something passed between them, a silent understanding, a connection that didn't need words to manifest itself. "I've never been good with words," Clara confessed, looking away first. "My father wasn't either. We communicated better in silence, working together, simply being." "There are things that words cannot express," Elias responded, returning to his carving. "Like the feeling of wind on the prairie, or the exact color of the sky before a storm." Clara nodded, thinking of all the things she had never been able to say, all the emotions that had remained trapped inside her like birds in a cage. The fear, after her father's death, the loneliness of endless nights, the fierce determination to stay afloat when everything seemed to conspire to sink her. "I've never been kissed," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the confession. The words escaped her lips like water breaking a dam, unexpected and liberating. Elias stopped his hands for a moment, but didn't raise his gaze from the figure he was carving. Clara held her breath, immediately regretting her impulse, feeling the heat rise up her neck to her cheeks. "Then we should start slowly," he said finally, with a voice so soft it seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind. Clara didn't know what to respond to that. They remained silent again, but now it was a different silence, charged with possibilities, with unspoken expectations, with promises not yet made, but already floating in the air between them. After a while, Elias finished his carving. He carefully cleaned the wood shavings and extended his hand to offer her the small bird. "For you," he said simply. Clara took the figure in her hands, feeling the smoothness of the polished wood, admiring the delicate details of the feathers, the graceful curve of the neck, the determination captured in the posture of the extended wings. "It's beautiful," she murmured, passing her fingers over the surface as if she could feel the latent life within the wood. "It's a kestrel," Elias explained. "I've seen them fly over your lands. They're small but brave, capable of confronting much larger birds to defend their territory." Clara understood the implicit message, the silent metaphor. Like the bird carved in her hands, she too was small in the face of adversaries like Silas Crowley. But that didn't mean she couldn't defend herself, that she lacked strength. "Thank you," she said, and in that single word, she deposited everything she didn't know how to express. Elias stood, putting his knife in his pocket. "Good night, Clara," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different, as if it were the first time someone had called her that, really that. "Good night, Elias," she responded, pressing the small wooden bird against her chest like a talisman against loneliness. That night, while preparing for sleep, Clara placed the carved kestrel on the mantel above the fireplace next to her mother's. Blue shawl, two symbols of the lost and the found, of what was and what could be. And for the first time in a long while, the silence of the cabin didn't seem empty to her, but full of promises. Autumn was beginning to hint at itself in summers. Hedges, painting the treetops with golden touches and cooling the mornings with a subtle breath that would soon become frost. Clara woke with the first light, that moment of day when the world seemed suspended between two states, neither completely awake nor entirely asleep. She dressed quickly, feeling the freshness of the air on her skin. She had spent the night dreaming of the plum grove, with ripe fruits falling like purple raindrops on the earth. It was a recurring dream, one that visited her mind each year around this time, like a reminder that harvest season was approaching. She left the cabin quietly, although she knew Elias was probably already awake, busy with some of the countless tasks he had assigned himself. In recent days, he had been strengthening the stable, preparing it for the winter that was approaching. A winter that, for the first time since her father's death, Clara wouldn't face alone. The path to the plum grove was damp with morning dew, and the tall grass caressed her legs as she advanced. In the distance, the trees formed a patch of darker color against the horizon, like an island in the sea of the prairie. When she reached the grove, the light filtered through the branches created dancing patterns on the ground, covered with fallen leaves and wild grass. Clara breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the sweet and slightly acidic aroma of ripe plums. This place had always produced in her a feeling of recollection, almost sacred, as if time flowed at a different rhythm among these trees planted by her father's hands. "It's beautiful." Elias's voice behind her startled her slightly. She turned, to find him standing a few steps away, with a wicker basket in his hands. "I thought you might need this," he explained, offering her the basket, "for the harvest." Clara took it, involuntarily brushing Elias's fingers with hers, a brief but electric contact that sent a tingle up her arm. "Thank you," she responded, seeking to regain her composure. "My father and I used to come together every year. He said the plums tasted better when picked at dawn, when they still held the night's freshness." Elias nodded, looking around with genuine appreciation. "The trees are heavy this year," he observed. "It looks like it will be a good harvest." My father believed that plum trees bear fruit according to how the heart of their caretaker has been. Clara said, repeating the words she had heard so many times in her childhood. "He said you could know much about a person by how their trees bore fruit." Elias smiled, one of those rare smiles that completely transformed his face, softening the hard lines that life had carved in him. "Then these trees have been very well cared for," he said, extending a hand to gently touch a ripe fruit hanging from a low branch. They worked in silence for the next hour, moving among the trees with a natural synchrony, as if they had been performing this task together for years. Clara reached the lower branches, while Elias took care of the higher ones. The basket gradually filled with the purple treasure of the plums, each one a small miracle of nature, perfect in its imperfection. "This was my father's favorite place," Clara commented, while selecting a particularly beautiful plum. "He came here when he needed to think, when he felt lost or overwhelmed. He said the trees reminded him that everything has its time, that you can't rush growth or ripening, that you have to trust in the process." Elias stopped picking and looked at her attentively, as if absorbing every word. "It's a good place to find clarity," he said finally. "There's a peace here that isn't easily found." Clara nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for this man who seemed to understand without need for long explanations, who resonated with the things that were important to her. "I also come here when I feel fragile," she confessed. "When loneliness weighs too much or when I fear I'm not strong enough to maintain all this. I come and remember my father, his determination, his love for this land." Elias set his basket on the ground and approached her, reducing the physical distance as they had been reducing the emotional distance, little by little, day by day. "You're stronger than you think, Clara," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that made her almost believe him. "I've seen you face each day with a determination few possess." Clara felt something loosen inside her, a knot of contained emotions she had been pressing against her heart for so long it had become part of her. "Sometimes I'm afraid," she admitted, and the words came out like a sigh. "Of losing this land, of not being able to defend it against men like Crowley, of failing my father's memory." "Fear isn't weakness," Elias responded. "It's just a sign that something matters enough to you to fear losing it." There was something in his gaze, a deep understanding that made Clara wonder what fears inhabited this man's heart, what losses he had suffered, what internal battles he fought. "Do you also have fears sometimes?" she asked. Elias turned his gaze toward the trees, as if searching for the right words among the fruit-laden branches. "I served as a messenger during the war," he said finally, and his voice acquired a deeper tone, as if descending to a dark place within himself. "My younger brother and I enlisted together. He didn't return. An ambush. I should have been there, but I had been assigned another route that day." Clara held her breath, feeling the weight of the confession, understanding what it had cost him to share it. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were insufficient but necessary. "I've been traveling since then," Elias continued, without stopping too long in any place, without allowing myself to put down roots, as if somehow by staying still, I was betraying his memory. Clara thought about how their situations had reversed. She, anchored to a place by her father's memory. He perpetually in motion by his brother's memory. Two different ways of dealing with loss, of carrying the weight of the absent. "Perhaps your brother would want you to find peace," she suggested gently, daring to lightly touch Elias's arm. "A place to rest." Elias covered Clara's hand with his own, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. "Perhaps," he responded, and in that single word there was an opening, a possibility that hadn't existed before. They returned to the cabin with baskets full of plums and something new growing between them, something as fragile and promising as the first shoots of spring, but with roots that sank deeply into a shared soil of loss, understanding, and perhaps healing. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, brought by young Billy Peterson, who served as the unofficial mailman for the most distant farms in the valley. Clara received it while mending one of Elias's shirts on the porch, taking advantage of the clear morning light. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Billy greeted, a freckled boy of barely 15 who dreamed of someday being a real postal service employee. "I have something for you, and my mother says I'm invited to a glass of lemonade if you have it." Clara smiled, setting aside her sewing. Billy and his mother, Widow Peterson, were among the few people in the valley who had always treated her with warmth, without the whispers and suspicious looks that a woman living alone usually provoked. "Your mother knows there's always lemonade for you, Billy," she responded, getting up to enter the cabin. "Wait here." When she returned with a glass full of fresh lemonade, Billy had already dismounted and was petting the small colt that Elias was training in the nearby corral. "He's a good horse," the boy commented, gratefully accepting the drink. "Mr. Boone has a good hand with animals." "Yes, he does," Clara agreed, watching Elias's figure in the distance, who seemed absorbed in his task. "What have you brought me today?" Billy took from his messenger bag a thick, cream-colored paper envelope with Clara's name written in elegant calligraphy. "It's from Mrs. Hammond," the boy explained. "She's distributing these invitations throughout the valley. She says it's for the harvest dance." Clara took the envelope, feeling an unexpected weight in her stomach. The annual harvest dance was one of the county's most important social events, a time when all families gathered to celebrate summer's end and the earth's abundance. In her father's lifetime, they had attended together each year, but since his death, Clara had avoided these gatherings, uncomfortable under compassionate looks or I disguised comments about her situation. "Thank you, Billy," she said, storing the envelope in her apron pocket without opening it. "How is your mother?" The boy finished his lemonade and began speaking animatedly about his mother's preparations for the dance, about the new dresses she was sewing for some of the town's young women, about rumors of who would dance with whom. Clara listened with a smile, but her mind was elsewhere, on the envelope that seemed to burn through her apron fabric. When Billy finally left, promising to return soon with more mail, Clara remained alone on the porch, looking at the horizon without really seeing it. She took out the envelope and opened it carefully, confirming what she already knew. A formal invitation to the harvest dance to be held at the Hammond barn the following Saturday. "News?" Elias asked, approaching the porch. His face was slightly reddened from effort and sun, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Clara showed him the invitation. "The annual harvest dance," she explained. "A tradition in the valley, all families attend." Elias nodded, taking a seat on the porch step. Clara noticed he maintained a certain distance, as he always did when they were in sight of others, even when that other was just Billy Peterson riding away down the path. "Will you go?" he asked with a tone Clara couldn't interpret. She looked at the invitation again, running her fingers over the elegantly printed letters. "I haven't gone since my father died," she confessed. "I didn't feel welcome. Or perhaps it was I who didn't want to face everyone with their looks of pity or their comments about what I should do with my life." Elias remained silent for a moment, contemplating the horizon as if he could see beyond the line where sky touched earth. "You should go," he said finally. "It's your community, your people. Don't let them separate you from that." Clara looked at him surprised, not so much by the advice itself, but by the intensity with which he had given it. "Would you come with me?" she asked, and the question seemed to float between them like one of those dandelion seeds that the wind carries across the prairie, light but laden with future. Elias turned to look at her, and his eyes reflected a mixture of emotions Clara couldn't completely decipher. "Are you sure?" he asked in turn. "People will talk." "People always talk," Clara responded with a small smile. "At least we'll give them something interesting to talk about." A brief but genuine smile illuminated Elias's face, completely transforming it. "Then yes, Clara Whitmore," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a song. "I'll accompany you to the dance." The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Clara dusted off the only good dress she had, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother and that she had modified years ago. She washed it carefully, ironed it, and added a small lace detail at the neck, using a piece she had saved from an old tablecloth. Elias, for his part, showed unexpected concern for his own appearance. He cut his hair and beard, and Clara caught him polishing his worn boots with a care that almost seemed touching to her. The night of the dance, Clara prepared herself with a care she hadn't allowed herself in years. She bathed with water perfumed with wildflower petals, combed her brown hair into a simple but elegant bun, and put on the blue dress that, miraculously, still fit her well. As a final touch, she took from the cedar chest her mother's blue shawl. She unfolded it carefully, feeling the softness of the wool between her fingers. It was the same tone as the dress, a deep blue like the evening sky. She placed it over her shoulders, and for a moment felt as if her mother were there, embracing her. When she left her room, she found Elias waiting in the living room. He had put on his only good shirt, carefully washed and ironed, and pants Clara hadn't seen him wear before, but what impressed her most was his expression upon seeing her, a mixture of admiration, surprise, and something deeper that made Clara's heart skip a beat. "You are—" he began, but words seemed to abandon him. "Thank you," she responded, understanding what he couldn't say. "You too." The journey to the Hammond barn was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. It wasn't just about facing the community again after so much time in isolation. It was also about doing so with Elias at her side, about presenting herself to everyone with this man who had become such an essential part of her life in such a short time. As they approached, they could see the lights illuminating the barn and hear the music floating in the night air. Carriages and horses were arranged in orderly rows, and the sound of laughter and conversations mixed with the melody of a violin and an accordion. Elias stopped the cart at a certain distance, as if giving Clara one last chance to change her mind. She breathed deeply, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders. "I'm ready," she said with more confidence than she felt. He nodded, descended from the cart, and walked around to help her down, offering his hand. Clara took it, feeling the warmth and strength of his fingers intertwined with hers. For a moment they looked into each other's eyes under the moon's silvery light, and everything else seemed to fade away. The dance, the people, their fears. Only the two of them existed, united by something that went beyond words. Then, together, they walked toward the light and music, toward a world that would soon have to recognize what they were barely beginning to admit to themselves. The Hammond barn had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns and oil lamps hung from the beams, projecting a golden glow over the wide, clear space. Garlands of wildflowers and pine branches decorated the walls, and long tables arranged on the sides held an abundance of food and drink. Fruit, cakes, freshly baked breads, jugs of cider and homemade wine. Music filled the air. A violin, an accordion, and a banjo, played by three older men who knew the valley's traditional melodies as well as they knew their own hands. Some couples were already dancing in the center, spinning to the cheerful rhythm of a polka, while others conversed in small groups, laughing and sharing the summer's news. When Clara and Elias entered, there was an almost imperceptible moment when conversations diminished and gazes turned toward them. Clara felt herself tense under the scrutiny, but Elias's hand on the small of her back, a light but firm touch, gave her the courage to continue forward. Martha Hammond, the hostess, hurried to receive them with a smile that couldn't completely hide her curiosity. "Clara Whitmore, what a joy to see you after so long," she exclaimed, taking Clara's hands in hers. "And you've brought company." Her gaze shifted to Elias, quickly evaluating him from head to toe. "Elias Boone," he introduced himself, slightly inclining his head. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Hammond. You have a beautiful barn." Martha seemed to appreciate the compliment, and her expression softened slightly. "Welcome, both of you," she said, pointing toward the tables. "There's food and drink in abundance, and the night is young. Enjoy the dance." As she moved away to receive other guests, Clara and Elias ventured deeper into the barn. Clara could feel the looks and hear the murmurs around her, but she tried to ignore them, concentrating on the music, on the simple beauty of the place, on Elias's comforting presence at her side. Soon, some familiar faces approached to greet them. Widow Peterson, who embraced Clara with genuine affection. Old Doctor Wilson, who had attended her father in his last days. The Lawson couple, who always bought her plums to make preserves. Small gestures of kindness that gradually relaxed the tension Clara carried in her shoulders. Elias kept himself slightly apart during these interactions, watching with attentive eyes but without interfering, allowing Clara to reconnect with her community at her own pace. But not all the looks were kind. In a corner of the barn, Silas Crowley observed the scene with narrowed eyes, surrounded by some of the valley's most influential ranchers. When his gaze met Clara's, he raised his glass in a mocking toast that sent a chill down her spine. "Don't let it affect you," Elias murmured, who seemed to have noticed the exchange. "He's trying to intimidate you." Clara nodded, but Crowley's presence had slightly darkened her mood. She knew he wasn't there just to dance and socialize. Silas Crowley never missed an opportunity to advance his objectives. The music changed to a slower melody, a waltz that Clara recognized from the dances of her youth. Couples formed in the barn's center, moving with the grace that familiarity gives. "Do you dance?" Elias asked, extending his hand toward her. Clara looked at him surprised. In all the time they had been together, they had never been so close, except for that almost kiss on the porch weeks ago. "I don't know if I remember how," she confessed, feeling a nervousness that had nothing to do with the people surrounding them. "I'll guide you," he responded with a small smile. "Just follow me." Clara took his hand and let him lead her to the barn's center. The first notes of the waltz enveloped them, as Elias placed his other hand on Clara's waist, and she, after a moment of doubt, rested hers on his shoulder. The first steps were rigid, unsure. Clara was too conscious of the eyes following them, of Elias's body's proximity, of how her heart beat forcefully against her ribs. "Breathe," Elias whispered, leaning slightly toward her. "It's just you and me, no one else." Clara raised her gaze, meeting Elias's eyes, as blue and deep as the night sky. And something loosened inside her, a tension she had been holding for so long it had become part of her being. Her movements became more fluid, more natural, as if her body remembered a dance her mind had forgotten. They turned gently among the Other couples, and for a moment, Clara allowed herself to forget everything else. Worries about the farm, Crowley's latent threat, the murmurs around her. Only the music existed, the warmth of Elias's hand on her waist, and that new and dizzying sensation of being exactly where she should be. The melody reached its end too soon. The couples separated amid applause and laughter, but Clara and Elias remained motionless for a moment, as if neither wanted to break the spell that enveloped them. It was then that Silas Crowley approached, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he greeted, deliberately ignoring Elias, "a pleasure to see you abandon your seclusion. We were beginning to fear you had become a hermit." Clara tensed but maintained her composure. "Mr. Crowley," she responded with courteous coldness, "the pleasure is mine to confirm that your concern for me is so constant." Silas laughed, a harsh sound that contained no genuine joy. "I always worry about my neighbors," he said, taking a sip of his drink, "especially those who seem vulnerable." His gaze shifted to Elias, evaluating him with barely disguised contempt. "Although I see you're no longer so alone. What a fortunate coincidence, a vagabond appearing at your door just when you needed him most." Elias took a step forward and, although his posture seemed relaxed, Clara could feel the tension in him, like a predator ready to pounce. "Mr. Crowley," he said, with a voice so controlled it was more intimidating than any open threat. "Miss Whitmore and I were enjoying the dance. If you'll excuse us." Crowley didn't move, deliberately blocking their path. "There are certain lands, and certain women who need real owners," he said, looking directly at Clara, "not temporary guardians who will disappear with the first north wind." Before Elias could respond, Clara stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "I am the owner of my lands and of myself, Mr. Crowley," she said, with a clear voice that attracted the attention of those nearby, "and I choose with whom to share them. Now, if you'll excuse us, my companion has promised me another dance." Without waiting for a response, she took Elias's hand and led him back to the dance floor, where the music had begun again, this time a lively contredanse that required partner changes. Clara joined the line of women, while Elias positioned himself in the men's line. As the dance progressed, Clara found herself passing from hand to hand, spinning with different partners: young Billy Peterson, who blushed intensely when taking her waist; old Dr. Wilson, who winked at her with complicity; even Mr. Lawson, who whispered a quick, "We're with you, girl," before bowing and moving to the next partner. And with each turn, with each change, Clara felt something reconstructing itself. Inside her, a bridge between the woman she had been, her father's daughter, the heir to those lands, and the woman she was becoming, someone who chose her own path, who defended what was hers, who dared to open her heart despite fear. When the dance ended, Clara was breathless but smiling, a genuine smile that illuminated her face in a way many hadn't seen in years. The women surrounded her, inviting her to join them at the refreshment table, asking questions about the farm, about her plum trees, about her plans for winter. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like the lonely woman from the Whitmore farm, but simply like Clara, part of this community, with her own place in the valley's social fabric. From the other side of the barn, Elias watched her with an expression that mixed pride and something deeper, something that closely resembled admiration. And when their gazes met across the space filled with people, something passed between them, a silent promise that shone brighter than all the barn's lamps together. Deep autumn arrived in the valley like a meticulous painter, transforming the landscape into a symphony of ochres, reds, and golds. Mornings dawned with a fine layer of frost that sparkled under the early sun, like diamonds scattered over the grass. Breath condensed in small clouds, and the wind, increasingly cold, announced winter's proximity. On the Whitmore property, the work pace had intensified with the urgency of those who know that time is a luxury that would soon be scarce. Clara and Elias worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the land and cabin for the hard months ahead. Elias had built a drainage system around the stable and reinforced the cabin's roof, adding an extra layer of protection against the snow that would inevitably come. Together they had collected and stored enough firewood so the fire wouldn't go out during winter, had smoked meat and fish, and stored apples, potatoes, and carrots in the cool cellar. The harvest dance had marked a before and after, not only in Clara's relationship with the valley community, but also in her relationship with Elias. Something had changed between them that night, as if an invisible barrier had fallen. Gestures of affection, previously so restrained, now flowed more naturally. A hand that lingered a little longer on a shoulder, fingers that brushed when passing tools, gazes that held in the intimacy of evenings by the fire. One afternoon, while Clara sewed by the window, taking advantage of the natural light before the sun set, she observed Elias working in the garden. He was building a low wooden structure that, according to what he had explained, would protect some plants during winter, so they could sprout earlier in spring. What caught Clara's attention wasn't so much the task itself, but the naturalness with which Elias moved around the property, as if he had always belonged to that place, as if his hands had been born to work that particular land. There was nothing about him anymore that suggested the wandering traveler who had arrived at her door months ago, with his belongings on his back and eyes full of traveled roads. He'll stay, Clara thought, and the certainty of that idea bloomed in her chest like a seed long dormant that finally finds the sun. They hadn't spoken about it, not with words at least, but it was there, in every nail Elias hammered, in every improvement he made to the property, in the way he spoke of next year as something they would live together, in that same place. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky with oranges and purples, Elias entered the cabin, bringing with him the outside cold and the smell of earth and wood. He stopped for a moment in the doorway, observing Clara by the window, with her sewing in her lap and the sunset light illuminating her profile. "What are you sewing?" he asked, approaching to warm his hands by the fire. Clara lifted the fabric, so he could see it better. A quilt made of scraps, among which stood out some pieces from Elias's old shirts, too worn to be mended but perfect for this new purpose. "For winter," she explained. "The nights will be increasingly cold." Elias approached and passed his fingers over the fabric, recognizing his own shirts transformed into something new. "It's beautiful," he said, with a softness in his voice that made Clara look up. "You're incredible, Clara Whitmore." There was so much sincerity in those words, so much genuine admiration, that Clara felt a lump in her throat. No one, since her father's death, had looked at her like that, as if she were something precious and valuable, as if her hands could create wonders from simple scraps. "It's just a quilt," she murmured, but her cheeks had tinted with a soft pink that wasn't only due to the fire's warmth. "It's much more than that," Elias responded, sitting beside her. "It's a home you're building, with your own hands, despite everything and everyone." Clara set her sewing aside, and in an impulse born from something deeper than thought, took Elias's hand in hers. His fingers, rough from hard work, intertwined with hers in a gesture as intimate as it was simple. "I'm not building it alone," she said, with a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Not since you arrived." Elias held her gaze, and in his eyes Clara could see the reflection of everything she herself felt. The fear of losing what they were barely beginning to build. The hope of a shared future. The amazement at how unexpected the path that had united them had turned out to be. "I'm not going to leave, Clara," he said as if he had read her thoughts. "Not unless you ask me to." The certainty in his voice made something expand within Clara's chest, a warmth that didn't come from the fire, but from somewhere deeper and more essential. "I won't ask you to," she responded, and the words sounded like an oath. That night, when the cold intensified and darkness enveloped the prairie, Elias didn't go out to the small shed next to the stable where he had been sleeping these months. Instead, he spread his bedroll in front of the cabin fire, in silent respect for the conventions that, although weakened, still existed between them. Clara watched him from her bedroom doorway, his figure illuminated by the reddish glow of the embers. She thought of all the nights she had spent alone in this cabin, of the silence that had been her only companion, of how she had learned to live with the echo of her own steps as the only response to her words. And then she thought of the weeks and months that had passed since Elias's arrival, of how his presence had transformed not only the property, but also something within herself, awakening parts she believed were forever dormant. "Elias," she called softly. He sat up, his eyes finding hers in the penumbra. "It's too cold for you to sleep on the floor," Clara said, and although her voice trembled slightly, her eyes didn't waver. "Come." Elias rose slowly, as if fearing that a sudden movement might break the delicate balance of that moment. He crossed the space that separated them, with measured steps, stopping in front of her, so close that Clara could feel the warmth emanating from his body. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse with contained emotions. Clara nodded, taking his hand and guiding him into the room that, until that night, had been exclusively hers. Moonlight entered through the small window, bathing the space in a silvery clarity that softened the contours and blurred the shadows. The kiss came as naturally as the next breath, like dawn after the longest night. Elias's lips were warm and soft, his beard lightly scratched against Clara's skin. His hands, large and calloused, held her face with the delicacy with which one holds something infinitely precious. There was no hurry, no urgency. They took time to discover each other, to learn the other's language, to build together a bridge between what they had been and what they were becoming. And when they finally lay together in the narrow bed, wrapped in the half-finished quilt Clara had been sewing, their bodies fit like pieces of a puzzle that always should have been united. The shared warmth kept the night's cold at bay, while the moon continued its journey across the sky, silent witness to a love that bloomed like plum trees after the hardest winter, with the tenacity of what is destined to survive. Winter arrived, in the valley wrapped in mantles of snow and silence. Days shortened, becoming brief parentheses of light between long nights where cold bit like a hungry animal. The prairie, once green and golden, now lay under a white layer that gleamed under the moon's silvery light, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal, almost supernatural. In the Whitmore cabin, fire burned day and night, keeping at bay the cold that tried to slip through every crack. The improvements Elias had made during autumn proved their worth. The wind howled outside but was barely felt inside, where warmth and light created a refuge against the elements. Clara had flourished during these months like never before. The loneliness that had so long been her constant companion had gradually dissolved, replaced by an intimacy that grew day by day between her and Elias. They shared not only work and bed, but also stories, dreams, fears, and hopes, weaving together. A new narrative that incorporated threads from their past lives, but extended toward a future they both began to visualize clearly. One morning, while the sun struggled to penetrate the grey clouds, Clara woke with a strange sensation in her body, a subtle but unmistakable discomfort. She rose carefully not to wake Elias, who slept deeply beside her, and went to the kitchen. The cold of the floor under her bare feet made her shiver, but not as much as the revelation that was gradually taking shape in her mind. Her cycles had always been as regular as the movement of stars, a constant she could trust. But now, mentally counting the days, she realized she was more than 6 weeks late. It wasn't the first time she noticed the symptom, but she had been so busy with winter preparations that she had pushed the idea aside, too scared or too hopeful to examine it closely. She sat by the window watching the snowflakes that fell softly from the sky, each unique and perfect in its fragility. She placed a hand over her stomach, still flat, trying to connect with the life that was possibly growing within her, as fragile and perfect as the snowflakes. "Clara," Elias's voice startled her. He stood in the room's doorway with disheveled hair and still sleepy eyes, but his expression became worried upon seeing her so thoughtful by the window. "Are you all right?" he asked, approaching. Clara looked at him, studying the face she had come to know so well in these months, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the small scar on his chin, the way his mouth curved slightly at the corners, even at rest. The face of a good man, she thought, the face of the man she loved. "I think," she began, but the words got stuck in her throat. She took air and tried again. "I think I'm expecting a child." The silence that followed seemed to stretch infinitely. Clara could hear the crackling of the fire, the wind blowing against the windows, even the beating of her own heart. But Elias remained motionless, with an expression she couldn't completely decipher. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, as if each word had a new weight, a special gravity. Not completely. But my body feels different. And I've counted the days. She couldn't finish the sentence because Elias knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. His eyes, normally calm as a summer lake, now shone with an intense emotion that made Clara's heart skip a beat. "A child," he repeated, as if testing the taste of those words. "Our child." There was such wonder in his voice, such reverence, that all of Clara's doubts and fears dissolved like snow under the sun. Elias brought her hands to his lips and kissed them with a tenderness that made Clara's eyes fill with tears. "I always thought my life would be like my father's," she said with a trembling voice. "Alone with this land, aging between these walls, that holds so many memories, but without creating new ones." Elias stood and drew her toward him in an embrace that seemed to want to protect her, not only from the cold, but from all past and future fears and loneliness. "You're not alone anymore, Clara," he murmured against her hair. "And you never will be again, I promise." Clara separated slightly to look into his eyes, searching in them for confirmation of what her heart already knew. "Do you want this? A family? Here with me?" The question floated between them, loaded with all the insecurities Clara had accumulated during years of loneliness, with all the times she had wondered if her destiny was simply to guard her father's land until her time came. To join him. "Clara Whitmore," Elias responded, holding her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "I arrived at your door as a man without direction, without purpose beyond the next horizon. You gave me a place to rest, a purpose to work for, a heart to return to each night. There's nothing in this world I desire more than to build a life with you here, on this land you love as much as I have learned to love you." Tears ran freely down Clara's cheeks now, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a love so great it seemed impossible to contain within her chest. "I love you," she said, and although it was the first time she pronounced these words aloud, they felt like the oldest and most solid truth of her life. "And I love you," Elias responded, before sealing their promise with a kiss that tasted of future, of hope, of home. That day, while snow continued falling outside, transforming the world into a white canvas where everything seemed possible, Clara made a decision. She took from the cedar chest her mother's blue shawl, unfolded it carefully, and sitting by the fire, began cutting it into small pieces. Elias watched her in silence, understanding the importance of the ritual he was witnessing. The shawl was one of the few tangible memories Clara preserved of her mother, a treasure she had jealously guarded for years. "What are you doing?" he finally asked when curiosity overcame respect for silence. Clara smiled, showing him the pieces of blue fabric she had cut with such care. "A cap," she responded. "For the baby. My mother made one for me when she was expecting me, but it was lost years ago. I want our child to have something of her too, a thread that connects them to this family's roots." Elias knelt beside her, taking one of the fabric pieces between his fingers, treating it with the reverence it deserved. "It will be perfect," he said, and then, after a moment of reflection, added, "I'll carve a cradle, with plum wood if you'll allow me, so our child can sleep protected by the trees that have watched their mother grow." Clara nodded, unable to speak due to the emotion that knotted her throat. Together, sitting before the fire while winter roared outside, they began planning the future they would build. A room for the baby, toys carved from wood, stories they would tell when snow blocked. The roads and nights were long, a legacy of love and hard work they would transmit to this new being who was already transforming their lives. And in that moment, Clara knew with absolute certainty that her heart's decision, made months ago when she allowed a tired traveler to cross her door's threshold, had been correct. Not because of the strong hands that now helped sustain her world, nor because of the comfort of a warm body beside hers on cold nights, but because of the way her soul, for so long solitary, had finally found its companion. Winter retreated slowly, like a visitor reluctant to say goodbye. Snow began to melt, first in small patches around rocks most exposed to the sun, then in increasingly larger areas that revealed the dark, damp earth beneath. Streams, freed from their ice prison, ran with renewed energy, singing songs of rebirth and renewal. In the Whitmore cabin, spring was announced not only in the landscape's change but also in Clara's body, which bloomed with new life. Her belly, now visibly rounded under adapted dresses, contained a promise that transformed each ordinary day into something miraculous. Elias had completed the cradle, just as he had promised, working during winter's long nights by lamplight. It was a work of art, each piece carefully carved and polished, the plum wood revealing grains that seemed to tell stories in a language older than words. He had placed it by the window of the room they shared, where the sun's first rays would illuminate it each morning. One particularly warm afternoon, Clara went out to the porch to breathe the fresh air that smelled of damp earth and possibilities. She carried in her hands the small blue cap she had made with her mother's shawl, giving it the final stitches. She sat in the rocking chair Elias had built especially for her, designed to relieve the weight she now constantly carried. From there, she could see Elias working in the garden, preparing the earth for planting. His movements were sure and methodical. His hands knew this land almost as well as her own. He had cut his hair recently, and the spring sun drew golden glints from the lighter strands. Clara smiled, thinking of how their lives had intertwined so completely in such a short time. Sometimes in moments like this, she had to remind herself that there was a time before Elias, a time when this cabin had been a space of solitude, instead of the bustling home full of life it had become, her. Thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. She looked up and saw Billy Peterson riding toward the cabin, with his messenger bag crossed over his chest. The boy had grown during winter, Clara noticed, his legs too long for the horse he rode, his face losing the last vestiges of childhood. "Mrs. Whitmore," Billy greeted, dismounting agilely. "I have mail for you." Clara put away her sewing and stood to receive the young man, who now looked at her with wide eyes, clearly surprised by her condition. "Good morning, Billy," she responded, smiling at his expression. "And it's just Clara, as it's always been." Billy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Clara's belly. Finally, as if remembering his manners, he looked away and rummaged in his bag. "My mother asks if you need help with—" He made a vague gesture toward her. "You know, preparations and such things." Clara felt a wave of gratitude toward Widow Peterson, who had always been a kind presence in her life, especially since her father's death. "Tell your mother I appreciate her offer, and that I'd love her visit any day she can come." Billy nodded again, still clearly impressed by the news of her pregnancy. He finally took an envelope from his bag and handed it to her. "It's from town," he explained, "about the new school." Clara took the envelope, surprised. She had heard rumors about the construction of a school in the valley, but didn't expect to be involved in any way. "The school?" "Yes, ma'am." "Clara," Billy corrected. "They're forming a council to supervise construction and hiring of the teacher, and since you can read and write better than most around here—" He didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Clara understood what it implied. They wanted her participation in the project. They considered her a valuable part of the community. It was a significant change from the days when she had simply been the lonely woman from the Whitmore farm. "Thank you, Billy," she said, storing the envelope in her apron pocket. "Do you want lemonade before continuing your route?" The boy accepted, gratefully, and while Clara entered the cabin to get the drink, she thought about how things had changed since the harvest dance. Neighbors who barely greeted her before now stopped to chat when they met her in town, invited her to social gatherings, shared news and gossip as if she had always been part of their circle. And although she knew part of this change was due to Elias's presence in her life, a woman with a man at her side always seemed less threatening to social conventions than an independent woman, she also knew something had changed within herself. She was no longer the solitary and defensive figure she had been after her father's death. She had found her place not only on her land, but in the valley's broader community. When she returned to the porch with the lemonade, she found Elias chatting animatedly with Billy. The boy gestured enthusiastically, describing something that made Elias smile. "Billy was telling me about the plans for the school," Elias explained when she approached. It seems they want you to be part of the council. Clara nodded, handing the glass of lemonade to Billy, who accepted it with murmured thanks. So it seems, she responded, touching the envelope in her pocket. Although I don't know if it's the right time with the baby coming. I think it's perfect, Elias said, with that quiet confidence he always seemed to have about important things. Our child will need a good education, just like all the Valley's children. Our child. The words still produced a warm sensation in Clara's chest every time Elias pronounced them. The idea that they were creating something together, something that would transcend their individual lives, gave her a purpose and joy she had never experienced before. Billy finished his lemonade and said goodbye, promising to return soon with more mail and town news. As they watched him ride away down the path, Clara felt the baby move inside her, a soft flutter like the touch of butterfly wings. It's moving, she said, taking Elias's hand and placing it over her belly. Do you feel it? Elias waited, with an expression of absolute concentration, and when he felt the slight movement under his palm, his face lit up with a joy so pure it made Clara's eyes fill with tears. It's like it's saying hello, Elias murmured, kneeling to be at the level of Clara's belly. Hello, little one. I'm your father. Clara passed her fingers through Elias's hair, watching the tenderness with which he spoke to the being growing inside her. In that moment, with the spring sun warming her, skin and life pulsing under their hands, she felt a fullness she had never imagined possible. Do you think we'll be good parents? She asked, giving voice to a concern that had accompanied her since she confirmed her pregnancy. Elias raised his gaze, his eyes meeting hers with that intensity that always seemed to see beyond words, to the very heart of things. I think we'll try with all our being, he responded, and I think the love we already feel for him or her is a good beginning. Clara nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words. They couldn't promise perfection, no one could, but they could promise love, presence, constant effort. My father used to say that raising a child is like tending a garden, she remembered, with a nostalgic smile. You plant the seeds with hope, water them with love, protect them as best you can, but in the end you have to trust they'll find their own way to the light. Elias stood and enveloped her in a gentle embrace, his hand still resting on the belly where their child grew, protected and loved. Your father was a wise man, he said, and you're more like him than you think. Clara rested her head on Elias's shoulder, breathing the familiar aroma of earth and clean sweat that always seemed to accompany him. In the distance, the plum trees were beginning to cover themselves with small pink buds, promises of fruits that would come with summer. Everything around her spoke of cycles that completed and began again, of endings that became new beginnings. And so, while spring advanced with sure steps over the prairie, awakening the life dormant under winter's snow, Clara felt she, too, was awakening to a new version of herself, not only as guardian of her father's land, but as creator of a new legacy, a legacy of love and hope that would extend far beyond the limits of her small property, toward a future she was barely beginning to imagine. The heat of late summer spread over the prairie like a heavy blanket. Days passed long and drowsy. The relentless sun punished the parched earth, and even the birds seemed to sing with less enthusiasm, seeking refuge in the tree's shade. In the Whitmore cabin, Clara waited. Her body, now in the last month of pregnancy, had become a universe of its own, a sacred space where life grew and prepared to emerge into the world. The baby's movements were strong now, sometimes painful, as if impatient to know what lay beyond the confines of its first home. Elias barely left the cabin these days. He had completed all pending tasks on the property and now divided his time between attending to the garden's immediate needs and being available for Clara at any moment. Widow Peterson had come twice that week, bringing prepared meals, medicinal herbs, and the practical wisdom of a woman who had assisted in dozens of births over the years. It will be soon, she had said the last time after examining Clara with expert hands. The baby is already in position, and your body is preparing. A few more days, maybe less. Clara moved slowly through the cabin, one hand always resting on the small of her back where pain had become constant. Despite the heat, she kept the windows open, needing the fresh air that occasionally brought a comforting breeze. That afternoon, while Elias repaired a leak in the porch roof, Clara felt something different. It wasn't exactly pain, but a sensation of pressure and release that made her stop in the middle of the kitchen, leaning on the table to maintain balance. "Elias," she called, and something in her voice made him immediately leave what he was doing and enter the cabin. He found her standing by the table with wide eyes and an expression of wonder mixed with fear. At her feet, a small puddle of liquid was beginning to spread over the wooden floor. "It's time," Clara said, and although her voice trembled slightly, there was in it a determination that Elias had come to associate with the most critical moments, that inner strength that emerged in Clara when it was most needed. What followed was a carefully choreographed dance they had mentally rehearsed for weeks. Elias rode to Widow Peterson's house, while Clara prepared the room according to the instructions they had received. Clean sheets, boiled water, towels, the medicinal herbs the widow had left for the birth. By the time Elias returned with Widow Peterson, Clara's contractions had begun in earnest. Pain came in waves, increasingly intense, increasingly close together. The widow took control of the situation with the calm of one who has witnessed this miracle countless times. "Breathe, child," she instructed, while preparing infusions and organizing her implements. "Let your body do what it knows how to do." Hours passed as in a feverish dream for Clara. Day gave way to dusk and then to night, while she struggled with pain that seemed to split her in two, that made her doubt her capacity to endure it. Elias remained by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement she barely registered, but that somehow anchored her to reality when pain threatened to drag her away. "You're doing very well," he said, with a voice that tried to project a confidence Clara knew he didn't completely feel. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." Widow Peterson worked with silent efficiency, checking the birth's progress, preparing everything for the final moment. When the moon reached its zenith in the night sky, illuminating the room through the open window, the widow announced it was time. "Now, Clara," she said with an authority that admitted no reply, "when you feel the next contraction, push with all your strength." Clara nodded, gathering what little energy remained to her. When the next wave of pain came, she transformed the pain into action, pushing with a fierce determination that arose from the deepest part of her being. Elias held her hand so tightly it almost hurt, but it was a welcome pain, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this struggle. "I see the head," Widow Peterson announced after several attempts. "One more time, Clara, one more time." With one last monumental effort, Clara felt something give way inside her, and then instant relief when the baby's body emerged into the world. The cry, strong and healthy, filled the room, a sound so primal and perfect it made tears run freely down Clara's exhausted face. "A boy," said the widow, with a smile that softened the wrinkles on her face. "A beautiful and strong boy." She wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and placed him on Clara's chest. The little one, still covered with the remnants of birth, had a wrinkled and reddish face, small fists closed as if ready to fight the world. But when he felt the warmth of his mother's body, he calmed immediately, his eyes, a dark blue like the sky before dawn, trying to focus on the face that leaned over him. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered, with a voice that didn't seem like hers, transformed by an emotion so great it threatened to overflow her. "We've been waiting for you." Elias approached, kneeling beside the bed to be at Clara and the baby's level. His face showed a mixture of wonder, gratitude and love so pure it made Clara's heart expand even more within her chest. "He's perfect," he said, extending a finger that the baby immediately grasped with his tiny hand, a reflex gesture that nevertheless seemed to seal a pact between father and son. "Just like his mother." Clara smiled through tears, feeling a fatigue that went beyond the physical, but also a fullness she had never experienced. Widow Peterson finished attending to her with expert hands, while Elias remained absorbed, contemplating the small miracle that was now part of their lives. "Samuel," Clara said finally, remembering the name they had chosen together during winter's long nights. "He will be called Samuel." Elias nodded, with a lump in his throat that prevented him from speaking. Samuel, the name his brother would have carried if he had had a son. A name that meant, "God has heard," a silent recognition that somehow their prayers had been answered, even though they had never been spoken aloud. Widow Peterson smiled, collecting her implements. "A good name for a good child," she said, with the satisfaction of one who has witnessed life's miracle once more. "Rest now, Clara. You've done magnificent work." When the widow left, promising to return the next day, Clara and Elias were left alone with their son. Little Samuel slept peacefully on Clara's chest, his breathing a gentle rhythm that marked the beginning of a new life, of a new era for the Whitmore Boone family. "Thank you," Elias whispered, kissing Clara's forehead with a reverence that spoke of gratitude and love beyond words. "Thank you," she responded, her eyes heavy with fatigue but illuminated by serene happiness, "for staying, for believing in us." That night, while the moon continued its journey across the starry sky and the prairie slept under its silvery light, a new family rested in the cabin that had once witnessed so much loneliness. The circle had been completed, and a new cycle began. The first months with Samuel transformed life in the cabin in ways Clara and Elias could never have anticipated. Days were now measured by feedings, diaper changes, brief naps that allowed the most urgent tasks to be completed. Nights became a fragmented landscape of cries, lullabies, and moments of contemplative calm when, in the penumbra illuminated only by the dying fire's glow, Clara fed her son while Elias watched over their sleep. The small additional room Elias had built during summer had become Samuel's space. The plum-wood cradle occupied the center, and beside it, a rocking chair, where Clara spent hours cradling the baby. On a special shelf, Elias had placed small carved animals, a rabbit, a fox, a deer, forest inhabitants that Samuel would someday know. One autumn afternoon, while Clara hung laundry, taking advantage of the last warm days before cold settled in definitively, she observed Elias sitting on the porch with Samuel. The baby, almost 3 months old now, was awake in his father's arms, his eyes, which were acquiring a lighter tone, similar to Elias's, fixed on the face that leaned over him. Elias spoke to him in a low voice, a one-sided conversation that nevertheless seemed to keep Samuel completely captivated. Clara approached silently, not wanting to interrupt that intimate moment between father and son. "And that plum grove," Elias was saying, pointing toward the trees outlined against the horizon, "is special. Your grandfather planted them for your mother, and someday you'll plant trees for your children. That's how it works, Samuel. We build on what those who came before left us, and we leave something for those who will come after." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. There was something deeply moving about hearing Elias transmit to their son the same lessons her own father had taught her, creating a bridge between generations that hadn't even known each other. Samuel, as if understanding the moment's importance, emitted one of his small coos that so delighted his parents. Elias laughed, lifting the baby until their faces were at the same level. "Exactly, son," he said with playful seriousness. "I couldn't have expressed it better." Clara finally approached, sitting beside them on the porch. Samuel, upon seeing her, waved his small arms in recognition, a gesture that always made Clara's heart skip with joy. "I was telling Samuel about the plum trees," Elias explained, passing the baby to Clara. "I think he'll be a good farmer someday." Clara cradled her son, observing his face that each day seemed more defined, more his own. He had Elias's chin, and something in the shape of his eyes that reminded her of her own father. "Or maybe he'll be a carver like his father," she responded, adjusting the small blue cap that covered Samuel's head, protecting his sparse blonde hair from the afternoon's cool air. "Or a teacher or an explorer. He'll have time to discover it." Elias nodded, with that smile Clara had learned to recognize as the expression of his deepest happiness, the one that emerged when he contemplated the life they had built together. "What's important is that he'll know he's loved," he said, caressing Samuel's cheek with a finger, "and that he has strong roots like the plum trees." At that moment, the sound of hooves interrupted their conversation. In the distance, they could distinguish the figure of a rider approaching down the path. Clara immediately recognized the black horse, Silas Crowley. Since Samuel's birth, Crowley hadn't appeared at the property. They had heard rumors in town that he had been in the east, closing some important business. His absence had been a relief, allowing them to enjoy the first months with their son without the shadow of his threatening presence. Elias stood, instinctively placing himself in front of Clara and Samuel like a human shield against any threat. Clara also stood, holding Samuel closer to her chest, feeling how the fear she thought she had overcome returned like an old wound that hurts again with weather changes. Silas stopped his horse at a certain distance and dismounted with the studied elegance that characterized him. He wore a city suit, not his usual rancher attire, and his face showed an expression Clara hadn't seen before, a kind of resignation that softened his normally hard features. "Mrs. Boone, Mr. Boone," he greeted formally, although Clara had never officially adopted Elias's surname. "I've come to present my respects for your son's birth." The surprise must have clearly reflected on Clara and Elias's faces, because Silas sketched an ironic smile. "I'm not the monster you think," he said, approaching a few more steps, "and I know how to recognize when a battle is lost." He took from his pocket a small package wrapped in fine paper and extended it to Clara. "For the child," he explained. "A tradition in my family for newborns." Clara looked at Elias, who nodded slightly after a moment of doubt. She took the package with her free hand and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small silver medallion with the figure of a tree engraved on one side and an inscription on the other. "May your roots be deep and your branches reach the sky." "It's beautiful," Clara said, genuinely surprised by the gift's delicacy. Silas inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I'm leaving the valley," he announced then. "I've sold most of my lands to a Boston consortium. I've only kept the main house and a few acres around it." Clara and Elias exchanged a look of astonishment. Silas Crowley abandoning the lands he had spent years accumulating was something no one in the valley would have imagined possible. "May I ask why?" Elias inquired, with a caution that indicated he still didn't completely trust the man's intentions. Silas looked toward the horizon, toward the mountains outlined in the distance. "My wife died 15 years ago," he said, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Since then, I've been trying to fill that void with lands, with power. But this summer, while I was in Boston, I realized that none of that really matters. The land will be here long after we've all disappeared." He paused, and for a moment, Clara glimpsed the man behind the mask he had always shown the world. Someone wounded, alone, searching for something that power and wealth couldn't provide. "So have something here that I never had," Silas continued, his gaze briefly resting on Samuel, who dozed oblivious to the moment's transcendence. "Something that's worth more than all the valley's lands together." Clara felt an unexpected compassion for this man she had feared for so long. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of shared humanity, of the fragility everyone carried within, even those who seemed strongest and most implacable. "I wish you the best on your new path, Mr. Crowley," she said with sincerity. Silas nodded, as if accepting both what was said and what was unsaid in those words. He turned to leave, but stopped before mounting. "Take good care of that land," he said, looking one last time at the small property he had so coveted. "It has soul." And with that he mounted his black horse and rode away down the same path he had arrived on, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun until it disappeared in the distance. Clara and Elias remained silent for a long while after his departure, processing what had happened, the unexpected closure of a chapter that had cast its shadow over their lives for so long. "I never expected this," Clara said finally, looking at the medallion she still held in her hand. "People can surprise us," Elias responded, wrapping an arm around Clara's shoulders. "For better or worse, we all carry more than one story inside." Samuel stirred in Clara's arms, waking from his nap, his eyes increasingly aware of the world surrounding him, fixed on the medallion that gleamed in the sunset light. Clara held it in front of him, letting his small fingers touch it. "Someday we'll tell you this story," she told him softly. "The story of how people can change, of how we all seek the same thing, even though sometimes we do it in very different ways." The sun descended slowly behind the mountains, tinting the sky in pink and golden tones. In the plum grove, leaves were beginning to acquire autumn colors, preparing for the cycle of death and rebirth that nature executed with infallible precision year after year. Clara stored the medallion in her apron pocket. She would hang it by Samuel's cradle, not as a reminder of Silas Crowley, but as a symbol of the universal truth his words contained, that deep roots and branches that stretched toward the sky were, after all, the best inheritance they could leave their son. Time, that tireless traveler, continued its course over the Montana prairie. Seasons succeeded each other like pages of an ancient book. Winters that covered the earth with mantles of white silence, springs that awakened life with gentle hands, ardent summers that ripened fruits, autumns that painted the world with golden brushes before the cycle began again. Samuel grew like the plum trees his grandfather had planted, slowly at first, then with youth's explosive energy. His first wobbling steps on the garden grass, his first words babbled before the fire during winter nights, his laughter that filled the cabin like music, transforming the space into something wider, brighter, more alive. On his third birthday, Elias carved him a wooden horse so perfectly executed it seemed about to gallop. Clara made him a cape the same blue tone as the cap he had worn as a baby, using the last scraps of her mother's shawl. Samuel rode across the prairie mounted on his wooden steed, the blue cape flowing behind him like a flag, proclaiming his right to dream, to explore, to grow. The cabin also grew. Elias added a second floor, with windows that looked toward the plum grove and toward the mountains. He built shelves that Clara filled with books, some bought on their occasional trips to the city, others borrowed from the valley's new school. Teacher, an enthusiastic young man who recognized in Clara an ally in his mission to bring knowledge to this remote land. Widow Peterson, who had helped bring Samuel into the world, came regularly to have tea with Clara, bringing with her the valley's news and gossip. Billy, now a young man, continued bringing mail, though now he did so officially with a uniform he felt immensely proud of. Life flowed with its own rhythm, marked by work and rest, planting and harvest, giving and receiving. Clara and Elias built their relationship day by day, as they had built everything else, with patience, with honesty, with the silent determination of those who know that what's valuable requires time and care. There were difficulties, of course. Her particularly hard winter that tested their reserves and resistance, a storm that damaged part of the stable and required weeks of work to repair, the occasional argument that arose from fatigue or uncommunicated expectations. But each obstacle, overcome together, added another layer to their union's strength, like rings in plum tree trunks, recording both easy and difficult years. One autumn afternoon, when Samuel was 5 years old, Clara found Elias sitting under one of the plum grove's oldest trees. He was carving something small, his hands moving with the precision that only years of practice grant. Samuel played nearby, building a fort with fallen branches and much enthusiasm. Clara sat beside Elias, enjoying the sun that filtered its rays through the golden and reddish leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and the slightly acidic sweetness of late plums. "What are you carving?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that had become as natural as breathing. Elias showed her the small figure taking shape in his hands, a kestrel in full flight with extended wings and raised head, each feather detailed with meticulous care. "To replace the one I gave you that first night," he explained. "It's been on the shelf so long it's wearing out." Clara smiled, remembering that night on the porch, the first time they had shared something more than words, the beginning of what was now their Lee. "Fly together. I don't need a replacement," she said, taking the figure to admire it more closely. "The original means too much to me." "This one isn't for you," Elias responded with a mysterious smile. "It's for Samuel. I thought it could be a tradition, a carved kestrel for each generation, a reminder that no matter how small we are, we can be brave." Clara felt something expand within her chest, an emotion so great it almost hurt. The idea of a tradition that would continue beyond them, passing from hand to hand through time, was a type of immortality she could believe in, not the body's permanence, but the persistence of love, of stories, of values, transmitted like precious treasures. "It's perfect," she said, returning the figure to Elias so he could continue his work. Samuel ran up to them, with cheeks flushed from effort and excitement. "Papa! Mama!" he exclaimed. "My fort is almost ready. Come see." He took their hands, pulling them with the impatience characteristic of his age. Clara and Elias let themselves be guided toward the improvised structure Samuel had built between two plum trees, a shelter made of branches, leaves, and much imagination. "It's to protect us when winter comes," Samuel explained seriously. "Like the forest animals." Clara knelt to be at her son's height, adjusting his shirt collar with that automatic gesture of mothers who always find something to fix. "It's very ingenious," she said, sincerely admiring the child's creativity. "But we already have our cabin to protect us from winter, remember?" Samuel nodded, but there was a gleam in his eyes that Clara recognized well, that flash of imagination that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. "But this one is special," he insisted. "It's a magic fort. Inside here, time stops." Elias joined them, crouching to enter the small space Samuel had created. Clara followed him, and the three sat together inside the magic fort, surrounded by the soft murmur of leaves stirred by the breeze. "You know what?" Elias said, putting an arm around Samuel's shoulders. "I think you're right. There are places where time seems to stop." Samuel looked at him with wide eyes, pleasantly surprised that his father understood. "Like when the three of us are together," Elias continued, "or when your mother and I watch you sleep, or in moments like this, when the world seems perfect, exactly as it is." Clara contemplated the two men of her life. Elias, whose face now showed lines that weren't there when he arrived at her door years ago, lines that spoke of laughter and worry, of sleepless nights and days of hard work. And Samuel, with his face still rounded by childhood, but already showing signs of the man he would become, with Elias's eyes and something of the silent determination Clara had inherited from her own father. In that moment, sitting in a shelter, built by her son, surrounded by the plum trees her father had planted, beside the man she had chosen to share her life with, Clara felt the circle completing itself. It wasn't an ending, but a continuation, a recognition that life flowed like a river, collecting in its passage the stories of all who had come before and carrying them toward a future they couldn't see but helped create with each decision, each gesture of love, each moment of courage. "Mama?" Samuel's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Why are you crying?" Clara hadn't realized tears were running down her cheeks. She wiped them with the back of her hand, smiling through them. "Sometimes we cry when we're very happy," she explained, "when our heart is so full that emotions need to find a way out." Samuel nodded, accepting this explanation with children's facility for understanding emotional truths that often puzzle adults. "My heart is very full too," he declared solemnly, "but I don't want to cry. I want to laugh." And as if to demonstrate his point, he let out a laugh that resonated among the trees, a sound so pure and joyful that Clara and Elias couldn't help but join him. Their shared laughter rose toward the autumn sky, mixing with the whisper of leaves and the occasional song of a bird, creating a melody that seemed to contain all the joy, all the pain, all the hope, and all the love they had experienced. Later, when they returned to the cabin as the sun began to set, Clara stopped for a moment to look back, toward the plum grove that was tinted gold under the sunset light. She thought of her father, who had planted those trees with the hope they would grow alongside her. She thought of her mother, whose blue shawl had provided warmth and comfort through generations. She thought of the path she had traveled from, solitude to this moment of fullness. Life wasn't perfect. Winter would come soon, bringing new challenges. Samuel would grow, changing and evolving in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Time would continue its implacable march, transforming them all. But in that instant, with the setting sun illuminating the path to their home, with Elias and Samuel waiting for her on the porch, Clara knew she had found something many search for their entire lives without ever finding: a place to belong, not just physically but emotionally, a place where her soul could rest in the certainty of love received and given. The wind blew gently, stirring the plum tree's branches as in a farewell. Clara breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the evening's fragrant air, and advanced toward her cabin's illuminated porch, toward her family's extended arms, toward the future they built together day by day, with the patience and determination of those who know that the most valuable things grow slowly, like plum trees after the hardest winter.